All right. So then at that point, Annie says, well, that was a bust. And he goes, no, no, no. It's not a bust. Gans just knows that your phone's not here at your house. He says, we can go find it. Doesn't matter where it is. Gans is still going to find it. He always knows where lost items are. So Annie goes, well, so we got to leave? I mean, where are we going? And he goes, yeah, sure. He says, we'll get in the car. We'll go find it. Gans will tell us. She goes, well, I know your goat can't drive. She says, yeah, he can't drive, but I can. Right? And he gets a big smile on his face. And he says, hey, go in the house, find my grandfather Quing, and come back out and tell me what he's doing. All right? So Annie's just kind of like, she gets kind of a frown on her face, but she really wants to know where her phone is. And she's really intrigued. So she goes back in, and she comes back out in about 2-3 minutes, and she says, so your grandfather Quing is sitting with my mother, and they're talking about wolfsberry and dangui and leeches. He says, yeah, that makes sense. Was my grandfather doing anything? She says, yeah, your grandfather was up and he was making tea. And he says, great, that's what I needed to know. He goes, we got about an hour, all right? He says, if we're longer than about 40 minutes, I'll text my grandfather on his cell phone. And she goes, your grandfather uses a cell phone? He says, it took me a while. It took me about 4 or 5 months to get him to carry one, but he does. So I could text him. He says, come on, let's go. We got to move. All right, so at that point he says, so Gans kind of trots into the back of the CRX, and Annie gets into the passenger seat, and at that point Shen gets into the driver's seat on the right side, and and so at that point Annie frowns. She goes, "What's this?" Right, and so at that point Shen puts on a 5-point racing harness seatbelt, right? Click, 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 click. And he's sitting in about a $2,000 Recaro racing seat. And she looks at her seat, which is just a stock seat and has just a regular one-buckle seatbelt. She goes, why is your seat so fancy and mine isn't? He goes, well, this car is very expensive. I haven't gotten to that part yet. He goes, I'll do the custom work on that. But he says, I just haven't, it's very expensive. All these parts are very expensive. And she goes, yeah. He says, but you should get to my seat soon, right? He just kind of smiles. And so at that point, he says, you ready? And she says, yes. And he goes, okay. And he opens up the glove box, and he takes out of the glove box, and he hands her just a plastic bag, and he opens it up. Okay, he goes, about every 2 minutes, you need to put one and he hands the bag to her, and it's like a sandwich bag, a clear sandwich bag. She opens it up, and she goes, what are these? And he goes, it's cranberries and almonds. And Gans loves cranberries and almonds, right? And he says, now every minute, you need to put a cranberry and an almond into your right hand, okay? And you're going to hold them out to him like this. And if he eats the almond, that means we go right at the next turn. And if he doesn't eat anything, we go straight. And if he eats the cranberry, that means we go left. All right? And so she's like, she looks at him really strange. She puts a cranberry and almond in her hand. And then he shifts the car into gear, spins out, and goes out real quick. There's a circular driveway in front of the mansion. And he zips that car right out and into the Westchester, Pennsylvania suburbs, right? And so Annie is just looking at him, and he's just intent on his driving, and he drives a little quickly. And so he comes to the first stop sign, he stops, and sure enough, Gans goes down and eats the cranberry. All right, and he goes left. All right, and so he spins those wheels again, gets it going, and they go through some beautiful areas with some nice trees, verdant, very verdant. And the Westchester area, a lot of Audis and a lot of mansions, a lot of McMansions. They pass some local shops, like a gumbo place, and make a few more turns. And each time when they need to decide where they're going, Gans either eats the cranberry or the almond, and so Annie remains busy putting those almonds and cranberries into her hand, right? And so finally, he pulls into another small suburban area, kind of like a small neighborhood. They all have names, right? And it says Hollow Glen, right? And so he pulls into Hollow Glen, and Annie gets this frown on her face. She goes, "Oh, that's odd." And he goes, "What's up? You know somebody in this?" She goes, "Yeah." She says, "A few of my friends live back here." And so, sure enough, she continues to hold up the cranberries and the almonds, and finally, Gans won't eat anything more, and at that point, Shen pulls his 1987 white Honda CRX JDM, Japanese domestic market, pulls it up to a mansion which is a Mick mansion, about half the size of what Annie lives in, and Annie gets a big frown on her face, and he goes, "This is it. This is where your phone is. It's in that house." And Annie just gets this really big frown on her face, and she goes, "This is Natalia's house. She's one of my best friends." And he goes, "Really?" And she goes, "Yeah, this is a serious problem, right?" And she goes, "I don't even know how I'd ask her, if she has my cell phone. It's been gone for 2 days. I already told her it was missing. I told all my friends, as many as I could on my Facebook page, that my phone was gone. I mean, if she had it, she would have returned it to me already." And he goes, "I can tell you right now, your phone's in that house." And he says, "Now, you really want to get it?" Right? And she's like, "Yeah." And he goes, "Well, you just need to tell me about what's going on at the house." And she goes, "Well, what's it matter? I mean, I'd be kind of embarrassed to ask my friend if she has my phone." Right? And he goes, "Well," and he looks around, he goes, He says, "Yeah." He says, "It's a 2-car garage. Why don't you text her and see if she's home?" And she goes, "Well, I already know she's not home. None of her family are home. They're all down at the shore, for the weekend, right?" And he goes, "Oh, okay." He says, "Wildwood?" And he goes, No, Rehoboth. They're at Rehoboth." And he says, "Oh, okay." He says, "Well, let's go get your phone." Right? And at that point, and he says, "Well, how are we going to do that?" Right? And he goes, "Well, we're going to have to go in the house." Right? And she says, "Well, they keep it locked. We can't just walk in their house." Right? And he goes, "Are you sure about that?" Right? And she says, "Well, I suppose we could." She says, "Well, there's an alarm on the house." And he goes, "How do you know that?" She goes, "Well, she's my best friend. I've been there all the time. If you go in the house, it's going to be alarmed. The tripped alarm right away." Right? And he says, "Well, that is a problem." He looks at the house again. He goes, "It's only, house is only 3 stories tall. I could definitely," he goes, "I could go up through one of those high entry points." She goes, "No, the whole place, it's alarmed." Right? And he goes, "As soon as you trip the alarm, the company will call, and then at that point, that's all she wrote. Police will come." Right? And he goes, "Yeah, I guess that's a real problem. Oh well." So, but then Annie, at that point, she pulls out her backpack and she says, "So you really think you can climb up to the 3rd floor and crawl in that top hatch near?" And he goes, "Well, no, I won't need to do that." He goes, "I can go up through the 3rd floor bedroom." And she goes, "That's not that's Natalia's bedroom." Right? And he goes, "Well, she's not home. Shouldn't be a problem." So Annie pulls out her backpack and she pulls out a laptop. And he goes, "What are you doing?" And she goes, "Well, I know her mother's code. So as soon as she trips, and they don't call the police right away because her mother is terrible about the code, and she's always have to call them and apologize for tripping the code. So they call the house first, and then they call the police. Then if they can't get anybody at the house. So what I can do is I can hack in, and she says, I'll just use the onion layer. I'll go ahead and hack in, and I'll intercept the call and use their intercom and pretend to be their mom." She says, "Now, I'll do that about 20 seconds after you trip the alarm when you open her window." Right? She goes, "Now, it's probably going to take you... How on earth are you going to climb up there?" She goes, "It was going to take 10, 20 minutes to climb up there. Everybody will see." He says, "I'll be up there in about 90 seconds. You ready?" She says, "You be ready." Right? So now it's the middle of the day, right? So Shen hops out of the car, and he starts to head toward the house. And the house is pretty large. It's like a McMansion. And he goes to one area of the house where there's actually a small wing on the house. and there's a corner. There's a place where two walls meet a corner. So Shen gets running. He runs straight toward the wall. He hops up onto the right wall, bounces up to the left wall, and leaps for the first ledge area. Pulls himself up on the ledge, runs along the ledge, and finds a spot where he's able to boost himself up using a window, and leaps for the second floor window, and then is able to do the same thing, and essentially parkours his way right up to the third floor. Okay, and he's on a slanted section of the roof, and he's heading right up to Natalia's window. Right, so he heads right up to Natalia's window, and at this point, Annie's in the car. And Gans is Gans has put his whole mouth in, and he's just eating all the cranberries and almonds at this point. He really doesn't care what's going on at this point. And she's like, wow, she's pretty amazed at what Shen's been able to do quickly. She has her laptop out, she's ready, right? She opens up the onion router, and she starts to, hack in, and she's ready. And at that point, she watches as Shen heads toward the window, and she hears a scream from within the house. Right? And Shen is actually leaning right up toward the window. The scream comes out, and he is startled and immediately falls back. Right? So he begins to fall back, and Annie, doesn't even breathe as she sees Shen start to fall from a third floor roofing section. And he actually, and at that point, he just tucks in and rolls onto his back. And then as soon as he can, he vaults himself right before he goes over the edge, and vaults himself over onto the other catty corner section of the roof on the wing. Right now, if he had made that leap a second later, he would have fallen at least 35 feet to the ground below, which was grass. But he would have broken some limbs at least, if not died. So he leaps and he spins in midair. And he throws out his arms and his legs, and he splays himself onto the roof, right? And Annie is just her eyes go wide, and she jumps out of the car, right? And she goes, "Are you okay, Shen?" And Shen stands up, and his eyes are really big too. And then Natalia opens up the window, and she goes, "Annie." Right, and at that point, Annie says, "Natalia," right, and the two of them are looking at each other, and Annie goes, "I'll be right down," right, and so at that point, Annie runs downstairs, and she comes up, and she hugs Annie as soon as Annie comes over to the door. Shen starts hopping down, and actually pretty easily is able to traverse his way back down, and he walks over. And Natalia comes over, and she's about to ask who he is, but then she sees that his hands are bleeding. So when he leapt, he has these major abrasions on the palms of his hands. And she goes, "You're hurt," right? And Annie goes, "Natalia, this is Shen. Shen, this is Natalia." And she goes, "Come on inside. I have some antiseptic, and I have some gauze, and we'll get you patched up." She goes, "Are you okay?" And Shen goes, "Oh yeah, it's nothing. I get these all the time." Right, so Natalia brings them in, and she sits them down at the dining room table. It's a beautiful large white kitchen. There's an island, and so she goes and gets the first aid kit. And Shen comes out, and he puts his hand down on the table, and he's bleeding. And Natalia sits down, and and she's pulling out antiseptic, and Shen says, "Give Annie her phone back." And Natalia says, "What?" And he says, "Give Annie her phone back." And Natalia is just kind of stunned. And Natalia puts her hands puts her face in her hands, and she starts to cry a little bit. And so she sits and she cries for a moment, and then she puts her head back up and she says, "I'm so sorry, Annie. I'm sorry I stole your phone." And Annie is just shocked, and she says, "Why did you steal my phone?" She goes, "Well, I thought something was going on, right? And I checked on your phone, and something was going on." He goes, "Dylan has been texting you for 2 weeks," right? And then Annie has a shameful look that comes over her face, and she says, "Oh, I'm so sorry, Natalia. I should have told you, but I didn't know what to do," right? And so Natalia says, well, I saw your text back, and you told him, don't text me anymore. Don't text me anymore. Don't text me anymore. Man, I don't know. I thought he was a good boyfriend. I really liked him. And Annie says, yeah, I know. And she comes around and she gives Natalia a hug, and she says, I'm really sorry. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know to tell you that your boyfriend was texting me, and I couldn't get him to stop. It was really bad. And I know you have those, I know you're getting ready for the SAT test again. And I know you're trying to get into Princeton. I didn't want you to be upset. And so Natalia says, yeah, it's a major problem. But, I really appreciate that you didn't text him back. But once I stole your phone, I didn't know how to return it, right? And so Annie says, well, it's no problem. Don't worry about it. And I'm really sorry you had this problem. And I'm sorry I didn't figure out a better way to tell you. And Natalia says, well, I guess this is just a serious problem, but I really appreciate your support to it, Annie, and thanks for forgiving me. And she gets her phone and she returns it to Annie, and Annie says, thank you very much. And at that point, Natalia patches up Shen, and they all go out outside, and Natalia says, wow, it's a nice car. Is that your Shen? He goes, yes, it's a 1987 Honda CRX, Japanese domestic market. Custom rims, about 100 hours of my own labor in there. And so, and so he smiles as he tells Natalia about the car. And and at that point, they both get into so Annie and Shen get into the car, and Shen waves goodbye to Natalia, and Shen drives Annie home. And that is the first time that Shen, Annie, and Gans solved a crime together.